And we are talking about statues this week, for our Village Torah session here on statues. So we've got this week's Torah portion, which is a double portion, or Edie, you had a good, it's a double header?
Double header.
It's a double header Torah portion. We've got Mattot-Masei to finish us up off strongly for the book of Numbers. And one of the components that we have in this week's Torah portion is what we have right here on the screen in the 33rd chapter of Numbers. God is speaking to Moses and asks him to tell the Jewish people, "You shall dispossess all the inhabitants of the land of Canaan, and you shall destroy all their figured objects. You shall destroy all their molten images, and you shall demolish all their cult places." Now, these, of course, God goes on, continues talking to Moses, talking about taking possession of the land, settling it, figuring out who gets which pieces of land. That's a whole other conversation for my purposes, and of course that could be many more sessions, many more conversations and discussions, but I want to narrow in on destroying these particular places, these idolatrous, creation statues, idolatrous worship places. Now, I'm not going to go into the linguistic aspect. Of course, we have Rashi, who's this incredible Franco-German commentator, and talking about the language. I do want to, what exactly is this? In the Hebrew, it talks about the maskiotam. It's super duper unclear what that is. Rashi basically says they would stretch them out. They would prostrate themselves and lay themselves out on these stones. Not going to go into it. But basically, we're just going to take it as these are places of worship, even though they're kind of strange words that we don't see often in the Torah. And as Edie pointed out, this idea of destroying these places also appears in the book of Leviticus in the 26th chapter, not making idols for yourselves, setting up for yourselves carved images or pillars, or placing figured stones in your land. Now, the difference, of course, between what we see in Leviticus is don't make for yourself. So it's one thing, what we saw earlier in the 26th chapter of Leviticus, don't make for yourself. But the new piece of the new mitzvah, as it pops up in this week's parsha, is don't even allow the Canaanite idols, don't even allow those to continue to remain in your land. So that's the totally new piece of it's the new mitzvah, right? It's one thing not to make for yourselves these idolatrous images, right? Or these idolatrous creations, but even to allow the Canaanite ones to remain in the land, that is newly problematic here. Any questions so far? Good, okay, great. So it's interesting when thinking about putting up some sort of statues, okay? Any statues. It doesn't even have to necessarily be of an idolatrous nature. It could just be some sort of statue. And yet we have something curious that appeared in just a few parsha earlier in also the book of Numbers. We have here in chapter 21 of Numbers. And Edie, do you want to read for us?
Sure.
Awesome.
The Lord sent seraph serpents against the people. They bit the people, and many of the Israelites died. The people came to Moses and they said, we sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Intercede with the Lord to take away the serpents from us. And Moses interceded for the people. And the Lord said to Moses, make a seraph figure and mount it on a standard. And if anyone who is bitten looks at it, he shall recover. Moses made a copper serpent and mounted it on a standard. And when anyone was bitten by a serpent, he would look at the copper serpent and recover.
Awesome.
Really interesting.
Yeah. The question is, what exactly is the function? And as Deb points out, is it something that's of an idolatrous nature? Is anybody worshiping this copper serpent? So on the one hand, it doesn't retain any idolatrous nature to it. But at the same time, it's definitely questionable, right? It definitely enters into a gray. It seems that Moses was okay and got away by putting it up because no one is worshiping it. On the other hand, there's something weird going on, and it talks about anybody looking at it who was bitten by a serpent would recover. And it definitely seems outside the bounds of nature, almost magical. I think it's a fair way of putting it. It's kind of folk magic-y, which definitely feels awkward. Right. Maybe it would only function for them if one had been bit by a serpent, then it would be efficacious for them for their recovery. But if you weren't bit by a serpent, it wouldn't help you.
Oh, probably because the Lord said it was okay to do. And if you have been bitten by a serpent and you're worried about dying, I think you'll try a whole lot of things.
It gets approval from God that anybody who is bitten, make it, mount it on a standard. Anybody who's bitten looks at it, recovers. So God says, go do it. It's okay. You can do it. And that's what Moses does. And it seems to be fine. Now, the question is, how much of this is sort of a concession of sorts, right? That sort of God just says, yeah, it's fine. You can go ahead and do that. On the other hand, I don't know that like God necessarily would have said outright, yeah, totally, go ahead and make a serpent. It seems almost more of like a divine concession.
Yeah.
Edie.
I was going to add, Rabbi Drew, that in the Cairo Geniza, there are numerous, when you mentioned the word folk remedy or folk magic, in the Cairo Geniza, there are numerous scraps and writings of ways that are magic incantations to rid yourself of other charms or of, I'm very sad, I have this. And there's translations of those that are out there. So it's almost, maybe it's also God's going, well, you might do it anyway because you are desperate because you have been bitten by a snake. So maybe try that as well.
Yeah, I think there's something going along those lines of it's sort of God's. I mean, we do have this very explicit God saying, yes, go do it. And yet at the same time, there is almost a sense of concession. Am I reading that too much into it? Or
No.
Yeah, that's totally cool. Yeah, go ahead, do that. It'll totally heal everybody bitten by snakes. I'm down with that. Or is it more of, yeah, okay, yeah, go ahead and do it. More of a concession.
I'm reading concession.
Yeah. In the literal reading of it, God is very straightforward and says, yes, go do this, 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 and this. So it's, according to what it's written, yes, you're right. This is God straight out saying you should go ahead and do it this way. And this is how people should act.
And it's really odd to me if you think about it. God's saying, yeah, go ahead. And yet God sent the serpents himself first.
Right, he did in the Garden of Eden.
By looking at the standard with the snake on it that God said to make, maybe it's, I can send these serpents after you, and you need to have the standard, the big thing that's held high up in the air on a pole to look at, which maybe will also remind you of me, which is even more problematic to put God in the box.
There's an interesting thing going on with power here also of God sending out these serpents against the people, causing them to die, and God's using these serpents as sort of like proxies for his power, and saying, all right, they're going to go bite you and kill you. But I can also create one that will allow you to live if you ever happen to get bit again. There's this curious interplay of literally God using these serpents as mechanisms of life and death. But also circumscribing it within this copper serpent of, you might also get bit, but I'm also going to give you this through me, God, am commanding you to create this life-giving copper serpent that should you ever get bit again by a serpent, I'm going to allow you to live through this power that I'm granting you. It's definitely strange. This episode stands out in the Torah because it doesn't happen again. It didn't happen before. It really is entirely anomalous. It stands out.
What else was, why is that there? And I totally skipped it. I was like, I am not dealing with the serpents. I'm just not.
There's
On writing the newsletter for when this portion was.
Yeah, it's one of those weird stories in the Torah that you have to scratch your head and really wonder what's going on, because it really stands out as unique.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
All right. Okay. But the story isn't over. So at least for the Torah, for the 5 books of Moses, the copper serpent story, it goes on. They keep the copper serpent. It's there with them. But this is not the last time we see this copper serpent pop up in the Bible, because we later see in the 2nd book of Kings, we see that in the 2nd book of Kings in the 18th chapter, we have verse 4. And Edie, would you mind reading for us again?
I will.
Yes.
He abolished the shrines and smashed the pillars and cut down the sacred post. He broke into pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. For until that time, the Israelites had been offering sacrifices to it. It was called Nehushtan.
All right, thank you. So it is funny, by the way, it's called Nehushtan because before it was called the Nachash Nechoshet. So that was, it's one of these things that over centuries people just shorten. Nachash Nechoshet becomes Nehushtan, right? It's a lot simpler to say.
But right there, it talks about it. They've been offering sacrifices to it.
Right. So
that would be bad.
Although specifically the language actually in the Hebrew is Katrim, so that they were offering incense to it. So it's the same idea though. So here we have, and think about this. What's going on in this I'm trying to think about the larger, but here it's King Hezekiah, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here, King Hezekiah, what's the very first thing that happens in this text, in the very first line? He abolishes the shrines and smashes the pillars, okay? And also the sacred post. So he's destroying all these things that are set up in the land of Canaan, and also along with them is this Nehushtan, the Nachash Nechoshet. So it's 2 things are happening. One is we now see that offerings of incense are being offered to this copper snake, this copper serpent. So now it's one thing for the Israelites to look upon it for healing purposes, like divine healing purposes, right? But it's another now that they're going ahead and making incense offerings to it. That is a step too far.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Transgressing. And so now it's gone into the realm of it's okay, God said so, to now it's replacing God. And now people are directly making offerings to it, which is decidedly not okay. And not only that, it's now being categorized with these other things, these shrines, pillars, all these idolatrous places and sort of physical spots.
Right. Right.
And so now it's gone into the realm of the problematic, and King Hezekiah says, this is all got to go, and destroys them all.
Yep. And didn't King Hezekiah pretty much say the only place you can make an offering is in the temple in Jerusalem? If I remember correctly, that was one of his big, he basically consolidated it to just that temple where the Shekinah of God often was.
Oh, King Hoshea. There we go. King Hoshea.
Okay.
Okay. Lord's our hero ran the 4th. Oh, then it talks about the 4th year of King Hezekiah. Yada, yada, yada. It's a good question. I don't know if they had it yet. Oh, at the time, Hezekiah cut down the doors and the doorposts of the temple of the Lord, which King Hezekiah had overlaid with gold and gave them to the king of Syria. So yeah, they did have Jerusalem going on as a site of worship.
Yeah, the only site anymore.
Yeah. Consolidated sites of worship. So in these biblical texts, really even though the Nachash Nechoshet, this copper serpent, really stands out as unique and as an anomaly within what's going on for the Torah, but the Bible writ large, ultimately it too becomes problematic and grouped within other shrines, altars, pillars, things where offerings are given for idolatrous purposes, and that's not what God wants. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to switch gears here, which is there is also something in addition to the idolatrous piece of it, and the idolatrousness really to some degree has a lot to do with allegiance, because ultimately some of what's going on, for instance, even what the language using the incense offerings to this copper serpent is something that is okay to be done in Jerusalem. As Edie was pointing out, there's a certain location for these offerings to be done. And it's one thing to make offerings, and that's okay. But part of it for us in Jerusalem is really demonstrating our allegiance to God. And I think that's key. It's our allegiance. It's really it's really showing where our values lie. We believe in one God, and this is our God. This is where we're going to worship him. Whereas we don't believe in all these idols, and we're not going to sacrifice to them. I'm going to switch gears a lot here, which is I want to go in a more contemporary route and sort of considering what's going on in our world today. When thinking about what building various structures or even statues signify. Now, we did talk about the snake that was built, this copper snake that was fashioned, and that was done in accordance with what God said, which was, you can build it, it will heal you. And I think God made it okay because we still recognize that God was ultimately the ultimate healing power. It wasn't just the copper snake that was set up. Ultimately, however, that got perverted, that got misunderstood, and people just started giving the incense offering straight to this copper serpent. And that was the problem. It wasn't the direct divine attribution. And thinking about the values, though, statues and other buildings are, to some degree, really a physical statement of our values.
Give me an example.
Okay, it's a great question. So,
or an example of what you consider a value.
Okay, that is a great question. So very directly, we have less than 2 decades ago, there were these Buddhas of Bamiyan, which were located in Afghanistan, and they were these statues that date back to the 6th century of the Common Era that were, I guess, they were Buddha statues. So they were, for those who...
They were huge.
They were huge, right. There were these 2 statues. The larger of them was 180 feet tall, carved out of sandstone in the mountains, and they wore clothes made out of clay. They were among the most impressive Buddha statues in the world, and certainly the largest. They were huge. And what happens is, in that area, the Taliban had taken over. In 2001, they blew them up. They destroyed them. Now, it's really fascinating to think about them because for the Taliban, who are these Muslim extremists, they very much believed in destroying idolatrous statues. And even though they were many centuries old, they still represented to these Muslims that this is idolatry that needs to be destroyed. Now, this draws upon the Quran, and the Quran then draws upon the Torah as mandating the destruction of idolatrous statues.
Right.
And so that's a really fascinating through line. Now, you know, a lot of the art, and I think UNESCO and various art organizations in the world were really trying to push the Taliban to refrain from the destruction of these huge, massive Buddha statues, and yet ultimately they did not prevail because, as you can see, they got destroyed. Now, that's a really fascinating thing. It also, I think, to some degree, says something not simply about idolatry, but also about values. That whereas you could talk about Buddha statues and worshiping them, the Chinese much believed in not allowing statues to be made. They also, interestingly, like Islam also doesn't even believe in having any depiction of Muhammad, right? They don't even, I mean, that for them, it's not something to be, you know, drawn out, visualized, or otherwise seen. Okay, so that's in a religious context. I'm going to go in a totally civil and absolutely not religious context, which is Confederate statues. So we have Confederate statues, which, of course, some were built post World War II, post Civil War, in which the Confederacy had its war against the North. And this graph that's in front of us was created by CNN and shows that there was actually a lot of statues built in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, and then there were actually a whole bunch during the 1960s, which there was a lot of you know, civil rights were a huge thing. I want to share with us one quick little video, which is really fascinating. I think can, again, in a very civil, not religious, in a very civil sense, can be of interest to us.
Because while some initial memorials were built mainly in cemeteries shortly after the Civil War, the real surge came much, much later.
The Southern Poverty Law Center says a majority of the more than 700 Confederate monuments in public spaces across the country were erected decades after General Lee's surrender.
It's true, as this chart of the years that they were dedicated shows. There was a big spike from 1900 to 1920 as white Southerners were reasserting their dominance through things like Jim Crow laws, with another spike in the 50s and 60s as the civil rights movement was gaining steam. So those statues weren't so much commemorating recently fallen dead as sending a pretty hostile message to African Americans. And sending messages is kind of what statues are often for. This one says, "We love freedom." This one says, "The most notable thing about our city is a fictional character."
I'm going to go in two different directions. So one, reflecting back to our Parsha, which is that even though like we mentioned in the book of Leviticus, it's one thing to talk about not creating our own statues. That's not something that's seen as necessarily a Jewish concept, not a Jewish thing that we do in creating statues or other things to worship to. On the other hand, in our parsha, it's not even allowing the idolatrous ones, the Canaanite ones, to still remain. And part of that, I think, also has to do with making the land ours, and not only really taking over, but also culturally, of really saying we're not going to still allow their ways to be affect our moral values and our cultural values. And going in a more contemporaneous direction, which is some of in the last month, the conversations and literally the statues being toppled in the news that we've seen, there were a whole bunch. A lot of those are also about values. It's one thing to talk about, well, it's a value of history that we should still have these statues, but it's another thing also to think about what values are at play. Is it okay to leave up statues of people who are morally problematic for our present and future day? And I think that's the conversation that's been taking place. Any thoughts? Although I think a lot of it has to do with how we remember the past and what we valorize.
Well, and I would interject on that. In South Carolina, they used to fly the Confederate battle flag over the state capitol. And there was a whole lot of turmoil about that about 5 years ago. And what they ended up doing was not throwing the flag out, down at the Capitol, and it's in a museum. So I think toppling and destroying, then risk erasing or trying to erase something that isn't going to happen or isn't going to actually be erased. Instead, maybe add a plaque and say, this is what they did then, and we don't always agree with this now, but here is the lesson we can take from this today. What's interesting, though, is that destroying statues has lasted since Numbers through now. Is a whole bunch of different ways to express taking over a place or owning the place, the supremacy, like you mentioned, Rabbi Drew, with the Taliban.
And values.
And value. And we don't want that in our life anymore. So rather than put it in a museum, we'll destroy it. Still, I'd rather they put it in a museum, but that's just me.
I mean, you could, you know, put things in a museum. You don't have to 100% demolish and destroy them. So that way, these things can still be remembered to some degree as part of history, and yet at the same time, putting out different statues that might more accurately reflect the values of the society. Next week, we get to start off with
Deuteronomy.
That's right. We get to kick off Deuteronomy. This week, we're finishing off the book of Numbers. Next week, it'll be Deuteronomy. It could be, who knows? We could talk about travel. We'll see what, yeah, I know Edie's interested. We'll see. I'll have to take a look at it and figure out what topic we'll tackle next week. 8 o'clock, same time, same place. Thank you so much for joining us today. All right. Thank you.